Right, good morning everybody. Welcome to another Worldwide WiSH webinar. Slightly different format this morning, broadcasting in the morning, and of course it's Heritage Day, so a happy Heritage Day and public holiday to all South Africans. Hence the colours and sporting themes, etc. And you'll notice that our co-presenter today, Pippa Mullins, is in the African bush, which is a fitting setting as well. So one of the advantages of doing this on a public holiday is that we're able to host a guest from Australia because the time zones happen to fit with a morning broadcast. So we're very, very grateful to be able to do that. And I'm going to let Pippa introduce the guest in a short while. Of course, we need to thank our sponsors of these WiSH webinars, Asino and Lita Pharmaceutical Company, manufacturers of Zifo. Thank you very much for your support throughout these webinars and for today in particular. And some other people to thank, of course, Nadine Peterson, our administrator, who so efficiently issues the CPD certificates. Make sure you click on the link at the end of the presentation to receive your CPD points. And to Dr. Robin Saggers, who does all the promotional work for these webinars. And then, of course, to our social media team, Jaco Swartz and his social media team, who really put out a lot of information in the weeks building up to these. So we're very grateful to all of those people who contribute to these webinars. And of course, to you out there, make sure that you use this opportunity to interact with a world expert in the field of sports nutrition by posting your questions on the question and answer section of the Zoom to make sure that Pippa can field them through the talk and make sure that your questions are asked and answered at the end. So we look forward to interacting with you. Thanks for joining us today. And I'm going to hand over to Pippa to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, John. And a warm welcome to you, Louise, for taking time out of your demanding schedule to share your vast knowledge and expertise with us. I've heard Louise speak many times before, and I must say every time I feel as privileged as I did the first. Louise is a sports dietitian with nearly 40 years of experience in the education and counselling of elite athletes. She worked at the Australian Institute of Sport for 30 years, first as head of sports nutrition and then as chief of nutrition strategy. She was the dietitian for the Australian Olympic teams for the Summer Olympic Games from 1996 through to 2012. And I remember the carb mouthwash being one of the nutrition strategies that came out after the 2008 Beijing Olympics, which we all found so fascinating. Her publications include over 350 papers in peer-reviewed journals and book chapters, as well as having written several textbooks, which consider the Bible to sports nutrition. She is the editor of the Journal of Sports Nutrition and Exercise Metabolism and is the director of the IOC Diploma in Sports Nutrition, which I was actually fortunate to do in 2008 through to 2009. And the exposure that I had to such highly esteemed experts and scientists was immeasurable. Louise was awarded a medal of the Order of Australia in 2009 for her contribution to sports nutrition. She was appointed as chair in sports nutrition in the Mary MacKillop Institute of Health Research at Australian Catholic University in Melbourne in 2014 and took this position up full-time in 2020. Louise, I'm going to hand over to you. And we can't wait to hear what you have to share with us.
Thank you very much, Pippa. Lovely to see you and some of Africa in the background. And thank you to John and everybody else that's organised the opportunity for me to be here. Excellent. So it was a lovely opportunity to reflect a little bit on where we are with sports nutrition these days in preparing this lecture. And part of it was thinking about the 30 years that I've had at the AIS and how different it was when I started there to what we know now. And if I think back to 1990, when I started working at the AIS and what we had to work with in terms of sports nutrition advice, this was the sort of information that we had. It was well evidence-based from a previous 30 years of good nutrition research. And a lot of the people who'd been doing this research gathered in Lausanne at the IOC in 1990 to produce an update of what we knew about sports nutrition. And here's just an example from one of the review chapters from Ed Coyle. And if we look at the kinds of strategies or the kinds of advice that we gave to athletes back then, just point out a couple of issues. It certainly was very focused on carbohydrate, but the kind of advice we gave was very prescriptive. It was all about absolute amounts. It was all really geared to an endurance athlete and probably a male athlete at that, when we think about the size of the grammage or the recommendations that were given in terms of absolute terms. And so back in the old days, I think we used to think that there was a one-size-fits-all approach to things. Research had been done, found an answer, and that answer was applied across the board to every athlete, regardless of their sport and regardless of other possibilities about them. But even before then, if I go back to what made me interested in nutrition, I grew up in a house where my mother was very particular about the way that we ate and was always very insistent that we ate healthily or chose nutritious foods. And I can remember one of the big things in my house was about eating vegetables, particularly our peas. And it was a really difficult battle to have all the time, to be sitting at the kitchen table, not being allowed to leave the table. But I very clearly got the message that there was something very important about eating peas. And so when I'm thinking about my view of contemporary sports nutrition now, it's sort of ironic that I can say that we can really sum up the whole ideas of what contemporary performance nutrition is about in terms of eating your peas. And what I'd like to do is to go through each of these concepts of what is underpinning the kinds of advice that we can give athletes these days in terms of performance. So let's start with planned, and the concept that we need to remember that things don't just happen by accident in the food environments in which we all live. And one of the lovely things about sports nutrition now is we do have a good 60 years of really rich research on which we can give guidelines. And a lot of those allow us to give some pretty reasonable guesstimates of the amount of nutrients that we might need to have at certain times, particularly before, during and after exercise. And so we can give advice in terms of nutrients, but unfortunately the way that people eat is in food. And there's a bit of a block between the understanding of nutrient needs and food choices for most athletes. Most athletes don't have the kinds of familiarity that sports dietitians have in terms of looking at food and knowing what's in it. And so we need to be more able to give people food information than we've thought previously. And as I said before, we can give guidelines for eating certain nutrients or foods around exercise, but often the environment in which people are doing their exercise, or their appetite, or some other aspect of what delivers food to them isn't ideal. And whether it's the environment or whether it's the appetite or the stimulus that they might have to eat themselves, there's often a mismatch between what people should be doing and what they actually do. So having a plan is one of the ways to help bridge that gap. And it's really the bread and butter of sports nutrition. And that's where sports dietitians have, an advantage over many other people that work in the space of nutrition and exercise, is that we're really trained to be practical, to understand food, to understand menus, to understand food service. And one of the ways in which we market ourselves is our ability to come up with creative ways of being able to deliver nutrient goals into food ideas. And these are just sort of some of the examples of the kinds of plans or the ways that we market the role of sports nutrition in being made practical in modern sports nutrition. So that should seem a reasonably easy P that we should all agree, yep, there's no controversy there. But it's really interesting that there's quite a bit of debate about the need to plan in some aspects of sports nutrition. And the example that we might take to look at that there's this whole controversy about whether we should be telling athletes how to drink during sporting events. It's become such a big topic, and it's really hard to understand how something so simple could become so heated. But it's really almost become like an episode of Game of Thrones these days, where we've got the athletes being pulled apart from two groups who are bent on destruction of each other. And if you haven't been watching Game of Thrones and need a reminder of the seasons to quickly go through it, if we start off with the very early days of sports nutrition, the advice was that we should tell athletes to drink as much as possible up to the amount of their fluid losses during exercise to try and limit dehydration, because we had some early examples of what dehydration can do in terms of sports performance in health and sporting outcomes. And so that was the first advice that was given to athletes. It was very much prescriptive drinking, and often it was sort of misunderstood or misinterpreted that the athlete should just drink as much as possible. It really had the understanding that athletes couldn't drink more than enough, and so the idea is if they drank as much as possible, it might get someone somewhere towards meeting their fluid losses. But with the recognition, particularly coming from Tim Noakes and South African colleagues, that athletes could, in some circumstances, overdrink during exercise, and the resultant hyponatremia could have some serious consequences in terms of not just performance, but health, leading in some terrible cases to death, there was a need to revise the way that education was given. And so the next iteration of the fluid guidelines started to talk about individualised plans, to say that yes, it was still important to try and reduce the amount of fluid loss compared to fluid intake, so that we kept fluid deficits during exercise to some sort of a benchmark, and it was given at around 2% body mass loss. And there were some examples of what that might look like in real life that were taken from some of the work of Tim Noakes. But it very clearly said, at least the way that I read it, don't overdrink. But even that wasn't considered good enough. There was a lot of pushback with these guidelines, and there was some sort of serious allegations made that anyone that was giving people advice about drinking to a plan, anything that was basically other than drink to thirst or drink ad libitum, was deliberately trying to harm athletes, that was all commercially driven, and that it was irresponsible. And so you can see when you've got this black and white approach to things and a lot of heated emotive words, it gets very difficult to say anything without needing to feel like you're on one side or the other. Now, a lot of this is happening at least a decade ago, and you'd think to yourself, well, maybe it's all calmed down now, maybe, you know, we can move on and we can find some common ground and play nicely in the sandpit. And it was interesting to read a review paper in Sports Medicine in the last 2 years, which came out and tried to think about the benefits and the pros and cons of either planned drinking or drinking to thirst. And this paper came up with the conclusion that there are different approaches to fluid intake in different sporting activities. Each approach has pros and cons, and you can choose the one that suits your scenario. And I thought that was fairly sensible or pretty middle ground, non-controversial advice. But within a month of that paper being published, suddenly we've got lots of commentaries coming out saying this is all rubbish, there's no evidence to what you're saying, you're wrong, you're biased, etc. So it really still isn't something that people feel comfortable about, that there's a middle ground. So the way that I think about it is that we really do need to find a solution and to kind of get to the bottom of why is this such a heated area. And one of the things that I've found, if you have a look at it really non-emotionally, is that the two camps that are supposed to be in mortal combat with each other are really not existing. If we take the two different extremes that, as I said, are often positioned as there's only two ways of thinking about this, and look at them, we've got this idea of planned or programmed drinking, which is being often portrayed as being forced to drink enough to replace all your sweat loss. This is often said to be the conventional guidelines for fluid intake. And then on the other hand, we've got this ad libitum or thirst-driven fluid intake, which if you take the absolute meaning of that, should mean that any time an athlete feels thirsty when they're exercising, they should be able to access fluid and drink it until they don't have thirst anymore. So that is positioned as the two different ways of thinking about this. But if you have a look at it closely, neither of them are really even real or possible. This isn't what the current sports nutrition guidelines promote. And I think I couldn't think of any sports dietitian or any sports scientist that I know that thinks that this is a necessary thing that you need to drink until you've replaced all your sweat losses. Most people know that this is not necessary and it's likely to produce gut discomfort as well as slow down the athlete in many of their competitive events. And then if you have a look at the other side of fluid intake and particularly apply it to competitive sporting events, which have got rules and conditions and an environment in which the athlete doesn't have always control over what they're doing, if you have a look at most sporting competitions, there's rarely a case for saying that ad libitum drinking could be applied. Athletes don't always have access to fluid when they need it. They often don't have the circumstances to drink until they stop feeling thirsty. The best outcomes could be found in some sports where there's frequent breaks or frequent access to feed zones, but it's really unlikely that athletes would really be able to do ad libitum or thirst-driven fluid intake in sporting events. So the way that I like to think about it is, as that review of about 18 months ago suggested, there's a continuum rather than black or white. And if we have a look at the continuum, it's about looking to see where fluid intake during a sporting event could be judged against the fluid loss that the athlete's incurring mainly through sweat losses. And if you have a look at a whole lot of different aspects of sports, there are characteristics that push an athlete to a scenario where it might be easier to drink than it is to sweat. So the supply of fluid is greater than the demand for fluid, or there are a whole lot of conditions at the other end of the spectrum of those characteristics where it's more likely that the ability to drink, the supply, is less than the sweat losses or the demand for fluid. And so the way that I look at it is to look at the athlete, look at the scenario of what they're doing in terms of their competition or their sporting event, and say, look at these characteristics, which side of the spectrum are you mostly going to fall on? And if you look at it from that perspective, you could generally say if your characteristics are pushing you to the left-hand side of things, there's a good chance that you may become dehydrated to a point where it'll impair performance or cause some other problems. On the other hand, if you fall into the right-hand side of the spectrum, where a lot of the conditions are making it easy to drink when you're not doing too much sweating, then it's actually possible that it would be a good thing for you to reduce fluid intake, to get advice to actually control how you're using that access to fluid. But in the middle, there's probably a whole range where what people do under their own devices, and if you want to call it ad libitum or thirst-driven drinking, that's up to you. I consider it really more to be just the status quo, what people will naturally gravitate to do for a variety of reasons. So if we can see that there's no black or white, but there's a whole range of different colours or spectrum, then the idea is to consider that every part of that spectrum could be considered a plan. If you decide that your event and its characteristics put you in the middle, where you don't really need to do anything different than otherwise would happen on a day without too much thought, well, that's still a plan. Planning to do nothing is still a plan. But there may be some scenarios in sport where you need to actually move to try and do better than you would do under normal circumstances, or actually do less than what normal circumstances might push you to do. Once you've got that sort of idea of should I move in one direction towards another, depending on my characteristics, then it's up to the athlete to work out what's the pros and cons of actually trying to make a change. If your plan needs to be costed in terms of, if I don't change what I'm going to do, is that going to cause some problems in terms of the hydration outcomes? You might also then think about, well, if I try to change what would normally happen, what's the cost of doing that? Is it going to cost me in terms of how much time I'm going to lose by stopping to drink? or the focus of thinking about that rather than other aspects of competition, or whether the expense of doing it or the gut comfort of doing. All those factors need to be taken into account before you decide whether you go ahead and make something different. And the other thing to think about is that during an event, there may be other nutritional goals that you're trying to achieve, and you can build those into a fluid plan. So I think it'd be good if we could sort of calm down our ideas about whether this is such a controversial area that needs to be kept fighting about, but rather say that anything that you do is really a plan, whether it's to do nothing more than what would happen naturally versus doing something more organised. And if you're doing an organised fluid plan, then there are a lot of things that you could build into it. Those things are about the practice of it, being flexible on the day, that if you need to change things because the situation's different, you can, and thinking about adding other nutritional goals into the fluid plan. But I think it's one way, if we could calm down about the whole thing, we could make sports nutrition more acceptable and our advice more revered, I guess, more desirable. So let's look now to the next P, and that's periodised, and that we now think about nutrition as being something that's not the same thing for every athlete every day of their lives, but something that needs to change because their needs and their goals change every day. So let's see, or let's think about how that fits into the big picture of sport. And these days, national level, understand and generally they encourage people to plan over a period of time, and often a year is a good time in which to think about the plan that you would like to develop. And it starts with thinking about what are the events that you'd like to be able to compete at your best. Many athletes try and have a double peak in a year, competitive outcome based on their physiology, their biomechanics, their psychology, their tactics, their nutrition, undertaking the kinds of training, the different sorts of stimulants, sorts of modalities of training that will gradually help them to develop the characteristics that they want when they get to their peak competition time. And so we understand that in a whole range of sports, there's an art and a science to putting a program together in cycles that help to develop each of those different elements of what's necessary for success. And these are all different sports that I'm showing you, with the emphasis on different aspects of exercise and nutrition.
Back then and review how we might periodise nutrition within that yearly training plan. There are ways in which we think about the whole of the year and the special goals that might be needed for competition, and whether we need to manipulate physique, whether we need to develop a special race fluid or event plan of nutrition, whether we need to work on supplement uses. All these things need to be put into some part of the year that's strategic. Within each of the cycles of the yearly training plan, we'll need to take into account that there's different energy, fuel, protein needs depending on the kind of training and the other aspects of our nutrition goals. Even within a day, we can start thinking about periodising, that we think about how we spread our nutrition, our food intake over the day, so that we have the carbohydrate and the fluid and the protein at the times when it's most likely to meet our physiological goals. And then we might have some specialised periods that we might start doing things beyond sort of normal nutrition, where we might manipulate things such as carbohydrate availability, fluid availability, looking at ways in which we can stimulate better recovery and adaptation. But there are all ways in which an athlete will gradually learn that every day is different, and even within a day we need to think about how nutrition is fitted in around our training. And so now when we start looking at some of the advice that are coming out for specific sports, you can see that it's quite different from sport to sport, but within the sport there's now this feeling that different phases of training, different goals of competition require different nutritional strategies. And if you look at the right-hand side of that slide, even looking at a week of training, different sessions in the pool may have different kinds of nutritional support organised. That's for swimming. Here's another one in terms of marathon training, where different aspects of the physiological goals that need to be achieved to race as hard as possible on race day can be built into a training program around different sessions or different phases. And that one of the key goals here is also this idea that different kinds of perspectives around carbohydrate intake might need to be practiced, that we might deliberately have some sessions in a week that are done with high carbohydrate availability, whereas some sessions are done with deliberate low carbohydrate availability. And the ratio between those kinds of sessions changes over different aspects or different parts of the training cycle. So given that we've talked a little bit about carbohydrate availability and that we no longer are talking to athletes about eating carbohydrate all the time in very high amounts, but rather thinking about the specific needs of each training session, it's worth reviewing our new understanding of this philosophy. So although traditionally we've thought about carbohydrate and particularly the muscle glycogen that it stores as the fuel that's important for performance, we now recognise that carbohydrate in the muscle has a number of other physiological roles. And one of its roles is to act as a signalling molecule. And it can tell the muscle, and by changes in the whole system, different messages about how the body should react in terms of the stimulus of exercise. So we now have this idea that we know that when the muscle undertakes exercise with a low glycogen level, there's a completely different response inside the muscle to that stimulus. And some of that's due to the fact that many of the proteins that are involved in adaptation to exercise have a glycogen binding site. And so when glycogen is high in the muscle, those proteins are bound. But when muscle glycogen is low, they're free and they're more able to be active inside the cell. There's also, as I said, systemic differences in terms of the free fatty acid levels in the blood, the catecholamines, etc. And there's also differences in the cellular osmolality due to the glycogen in the water. But by manipulating glycogen in the muscle to change all those different things, we can get a different response in terms of the post-exercise and during exercise stimulus, and that's the adaptations and eventual protein synthesis that's achieved through the interaction of exercise on the muscle. And not only does this happen in terms of what's during the exercise stimulus, but we also know that there's different ways in which we can achieve that low carbohydrate availability with different systemic effects. So there's different strategies here we can talk about in terms of setting up the muscle to have an experience of exercise with low carbohydrate availability. You can do it on a chronic basis where you're always eating a low carbohydrate diet, so all sessions of exercise are undertaken with low glycogen, or you can do it in an acute scenario where you modify eating and exercise so that some sessions are done with low glycogen and some sessions can be done with high glycogen stores. One of the most well publicised way is this, what they call train low, which is achieved by having 2 sessions of exercise done fairly close together so that the first one depletes the muscle glycogen stores. There's then a short recovery period undertaken with very low carbohydrate intake or absence of carbohydrate intake so that there's little refueling, and then the second session can be done with low glycogen stores to amplify the signal. So there's different ways of achieving that, as I said, but it's not just the during exercise scenario that manipulating glycogen might be useful for. There's now some evidence that says that if you delay the restoration of glycogen post, it's going to respond. And if you do the exercise with high glycogen so that you get the best quality out of the session, but then delay the restoration of glycogen in that recovery period, you can prolong the period of time for which the muscle is active in terms of the adaptation processes. That graph there shows that there's a relationship or an inverse relationship. As muscle glycogen storage increases, there's a gradual decrease in the amount of the protein expression back down to normal. And so by delaying glycogen storage after exercise, you can prolong the period of time for which there's greater adaptation following the exercise stimulus. And people are getting quite clever now in terms of thinking about how to integrate all these ideas again. And so we have what we call the sleep low cycle, where an athlete might do over a 2-day or a single day. The session in the morning is done with high glycogen, and it's usually quality sessions, so that the high glycogen allows the athlete to perform as well as possible. They then delay the eating of carbohydrate. Sometimes we do it as an evening carbohydrate in that meal before going to bed. So that's why it's called the sleep low cycle. And then when you do the next session of exercise in the morning, that's done with low glycogen levels. And so then you get the train low effect. And that's the kind of cycle that puts all those ideas. Before we talk a little bit more about it though, one of the things we might keep thinking about is what it means to a scientist versus what it means to an athlete. And it's interesting that we now look at different pathways, different changes. They can measure it, they can change some aspects of either the diet or the training to amplify it, and they feel that's really exciting. And one of the things we need to keep remembering is to see it from the athlete's point of view, that it's all very good to measure these changes in the muscle and to write about how they can be amplified. And that's the kind of science that gets into the high impact journals. We've always got to remember that athletes don't get medals for how much they have of these certain pathways in their muscles. There's no medals given out at the Olympic Games for PGC1 alpha in muscle biopsy samples. It's rather who can perform the best. And so when we're doing our studies, we've got to really always think about what's the translation to performance rather than what's just happening in the muscle cell. And if we have a look at that translation, sometimes it's not as clean as we'd like. So what I've done here is I've summarised all the studies that were done in those very early days when we first learnt about the train low strategy. And these are the studies that were done during that phase. And it often reflects the early phase of discovering something, that when someone does find some new strategy, the way that we examine it is to go hard, hit it with a big stick. And all these studies that have been summarised in this table here have taken training camps where different levels of athletes, either untrained people or people that were reasonably trained up to sort of sub-elite, had an experience from either 2 weeks or 10 weeks of implementing this train low strategy. But the way they did it in these studies was to do it all the time. They were training every day, doing this 50% low training, doing the first session to deplete, doing the second session depleted. And so this was a very unnatural training cycle, and most of the sessions that were undertaken with the low glycogen were the high intensity sessions. And so there was an effect on their ability to train hard. And in all these studies, when there were examination of what was happening at the muscle level inside the cell, there was always evidence of improvements or a greater improvement in the training response to the athletes who did this train low kind of training than those that did the training on a more normal carbohydrate rich diet without the glycogen stripping. And in only one of these studies was there an improvement in performance overall. This was in the Cochrane study. There was a benefit seen in the Hansen study, but these were in groups that were very poorly trained to start with. And so the translation for the athletes that would be more normal in our working relationships wasn't really clear. Later on, people then started to be more intelligent with the way they would use this train low, and they started to use the train low cycles, the sleep low cycles. And here's 2 studies that I was involved with in well-trained triathletes and cyclists that found that when you applied the knowledge about carbohydrate periodisation but integrated it into a more normal training phase, there were some benefits to performance over athletes who did the same training but ate carbohydrate for each of the sessions to keep glycogen high. More recently, we've been able to look at these same strategies with elite athletes, and even though we can see some benefits in terms of physiological performance, we weren't able to see any translation into better performance over a group that did the same training but had carbohydrate support for all their sessions. So this just shows you that there is often a disconnect between what we can see in the muscle level at a very overexposed look and the translation to performance. And sometimes we need to go back and sort of start thinking about what some of our strategies are doing in terms of the big picture. The way that I've tried to explain why we don't always see a translation of better aspects of muscle development into performance outcomes is that it's sometimes a matter of the study being designed badly, so that yes, the train low experience is certainly improving some part of the muscle's ability to create new mitochondria or to upregulate some of the aspects of substrate use. But at the same time, it was interfering with the athlete's ability to be able to train with high quality. And so one aspect of improvement was cancelled out by another aspect that wasn't developed. And it certainly takes that kind of training is more fatiguing. And so sometimes the fact that when you're getting the performance measure, it's being done in athletes who are more fatigued can mean that the performance doesn't show out quite so well. In terms of, do we think that there's a reason that elite athletes showed less benefit from doing this kind of training than the sub-elite athletes? Well, we can come up with a number of different kinds of explanations for that. Sometimes it's that athletes who are elite are different in the genetics or their fibre type, or they're already very close to their performance ceiling, and so their ability to get a change is much smaller than athletes that are at sub-elite levels. And sometimes it's because the training stimulus of an elite athlete is just so great that it overpowers any other signal that you might give it. When we do our studies, you know, we have athletes who might be doing a 40K walk in the morning and a 10K walk in the afternoon. And so when you're doing, you know, 50Ks of training in a day, walking or running, the stimulus from that training, the volume, the intensity that they do is just so great that some small tweaking by changing the glycogen content of the muscle is really quite minor compared to the big load. And perhaps that's one of the reasons why elite athletes have found over time and practice that very high volumes of training and very high intensities of training are associated with success, because that training itself is changing the glycogen level of the muscle without any need for any further manipulation by changing your diet. So there's certainly a lot of interest in terms of the physiology and the biochemistry of exercise, and some applications that seem able to be used by sub-elite athletes, but whether or not this kind of periodised approach to the elite athletes' exercise is as beneficial is still yet to be determined. Just the last thing to think about that, there's quite a bit again of discussion in this area of sports nutrition, and part of the misunderstanding or part of the controversy is that people are often talking about different things when they observe what athletes do or when they go into the laboratory. And so one of the things we've done recently, a number of the carbohydrate interested scientists in sports nutrition have put together a review paper that tries to explain what we mean by each of these terms, how it would be practiced in real life, and what the strategy is trying to achieve. And by doing that, we're trying to reduce the amount of misunderstanding that might happen in practice and knowledge. All right, let's move on to our next P, and that's proven. And it's really important that sports nutrition is based on real evidence rather than just the anecdotes or testimonials that we often hear from successful people. Certainly a difference in my life now. 30 years after starting at the AIS to think about where people are getting their information from and how we popularise or publicise the work that we do. And the way that I like to think of sports science, when you're working with elite athletes, you need to have an evidence base to the kinds of things that you're doing, but you need to also know that not every aspect of what your work does with an athlete can be put into a laboratory situation to get the really traditional way of finding the evidence. So there's some allowance that we make, even in science-driven behaviour, in terms of the insight from the athlete or the insight from the experiences of the scientist. So together, we start with the evidence base and then work around the individualisation of it. That's quite different from what we often find takes over the world in terms of getting most of the airplay. And that's what I call scienciness. And I've taken that word with a bit of liberty from Stephen Colbert, who more than 15 years ago came up with this idea of truthiness, which he felt was the way that people saw things these days, that it's not just facts, it's what your beliefs are. And when you're really strong in your belief, that's enough to make it truth for you, when it's really truthiness. And in terms of sports science, we can think of scienciness being the way that some opinions about science are then translated into some sort of level of fact, if you like, false news really. And often people take something that had a kernel of truth and extrapolate it way beyond the available evidence. But because they believe in it so heavily, then they feel that it can replace data. That's not just the only way which I think we need to be careful about being evidence-based, and that is to be able to think about what the evidence base for sports nutrition or sports science should be. And this was something that challenged us in 2012. I remember being in London at the Olympic Games, and just before the opening ceremony, there was both a program on television and a whole series of papers that were published in the British Medical Journal, a very prestigious journal, that tried to challenge us to say that sports science was a very weak area of science, and that we'd had 40 years of trying to come up with evidence base for a whole range of sports performance strategies, and each of them were found by this British Medical Journal team to be wasteful. In fact, the headline says 40 years of sports performance research and little insight gained. And they went through a whole range of different areas of sports science and pulled it apart and suggested that it was worse than useless, which is really challenging when you've spent your life working with athletes as a scientist. And the kinds of criticisms they made of the evidence on which we base our practice is that we always use small sample sizes in studies. And by that, they felt less than 100 was a small sample size, that we try to only come up with outcomes that are based on what we're testing, and we're not trying to find generalisable outcomes, that often some of the biological outcomes we look don't match with performance. And I've said that's true, but that doesn't mean that it's not evidence. That often the kinds of studies we do, we can't blind, and we don't randomly allocate people into groups, and that they felt there was a lot of commercial bias and over-interpretation in the marketing of the results. And they really made me start thinking about sports science to see whether, you know, I was a true scientist, and whether we as a community of scientists are doing things badly. And when I did look more closely, I began to think that that's one perspective that they come in. That's very much an epidemiological perspective on sports science. But coming from the other aspect of sports science, we need to be thoughtful about what we do. So what do we think evidence is to back our judgments? Well, we have this hierarchy of the way that different types of evidence is seen. And there's a difference between what scientists think is good evidence. We like to go up the pointy end, where we think we need to have meta-analyses and systematic reviews to show that something's working. Whereas most athletes are more interested in things like anecdotes and testimonials and their own experience. And so it's when you have this sort of discord between what people think is evidence, that can be problematic unless you see it as being part, again, of a continuum. So if we're thinking about sports science and whether we can find evidence that a certain strategy might be useful, it's useful to start at the bottom with these opinions and anecdotes and testimonials to find out what people are doing. Athletes have often been found to be able to work out things that are successful by their own experience. And often when we as scientists go back and have a look at what athletes are practicing, we actually find that athletes and coaches have worked it out for themselves, and the role of the scientist is perhaps to find the mechanism by which it works and maybe even help to tweak it a little bit more. But it's certainly part of the evidence that's important without providing the bottom line evidence in itself. But at the top of this tree of what we think is the best evidence, this is what the epidemiology approach is looking for, and this is what the British Medical Journal was saying that we fail to do, is that we fail to produce these very tight systematic analyses to say that there's evidence that strategy X actually works. And that might be true, that we don't often get to the point of being able to say that a certain strategy above all has very tight evidence to say that it works for all athletes and for all situations. But that's actually not what we should be looking for, because what athletes are asking us for when they're wanting to know whether strategy X works is a very specific utilisation of it. Athletes don't really care if strategy X works for everything or everybody. What they're really thinking about is what's in it for me. Is strategy X going to be able to help me in my 400 metre swimming race or the particular application of what I'm wanting to do? And elite athletes probably want even more specific information. They're thinking about applying it to the very specific competition environment in which they're going to be competing, or they're thinking about looking at strategy X as part of a whole range of different strategies that they'll be using at the same time. And so the kind of study that's going to provide you with information that's very, very specific like that is going to be necessarily very different to what an epidemiology approach is saying is the right way. So I think there is plenty of room in the kind of work we do that has a very specific endpoint in mind to do research that is valid but different to what traditional science might think. And so I've come up with my own list of characteristics of what I think is important in doing sports nutrition research. And even though the British Medical Journal might think we're not rocket scientists, I think these are the kinds of characteristics that allow us to feel happy with the way that we do our jobs. And if we go through those characteristics very quickly, it's really important that if we're going to do research on a specific group of athletes and want to apply it to those very the same group of athletes, that we choose the best of the group to represent who it's going to apply. And so when you're reading studies that have been done on college students, because they were a convenient sample in the university where the study was done, it's very difficult to take the results of that study and apply it to the national cricket team or some very elite group. And I have a joke with my husband that I very rarely read rat studies or mice studies, because although they're interesting in terms of learning some metabolism or mechanisms, they have often very poor translatability to human performance. And so I joke that I'll start reading those studies when they put rat races in the Olympics. Another aspect of the nutrition research is if we're going to measure performance, we need to have a protocol that measures it in a reliable way and a valid way. And a lot of the studies that are done use a time to exhaustion as the performance measure, as a proxy for performance. Although there is some learning that you can gain from looking at time to exhaustion protocols, they very often don't provide a really good proxy for the way that competition is undertaken in real life sport. And so we need to have better protocols. And we also need to make sure that they're very reliable. And that's partly the choice of the protocol, but also making sure that the participants in the study have practiced the protocol so that they're familiar with it and can produce a very reliable performance outcome, which allows you to detect small changes. It's important when we do the research that the protocol is set up so that it mimics the real life sporting situation. Often studies are done with overnight fasted conditions and people just drinking water during exercise to keep the metabolism tight. But in real life, athletes have different other ways in which they improve performance. And so if you're looking at a strategy, you need to be able to see what it does within that environment. So it's very important to build into your design all the different things that the athlete will do. It's important also to be able to measure performance in a way that reflects the differences that are important to sporting outcomes. Mostly statisticians look at thresholds where they will decide something has changed or something is different. But when it comes to the Olympic Games, even if the difference between the first guy and the second guy doesn't meet the 0.05 threshold, they'll still give out the gold and silver medals. So it's important that we can do research that can detect the small changes that will make a difference to outcomes in sport. It's important also that when you're setting up the protocol, you remember how the sport is practiced, the rules or the environment in which the sport is conducted, and undertake your strategy so that it can be undertaken within the rules of the sport. For example, there's no point merely doing a study to see if taking carbohydrate every 10 minutes helps a soccer game if the rules of soccer say that there's no nutritional support at any time other than pre-game or at half time. It's just not relevant. As I said, very interested in the sophisticated ways in which we can look at mechanisms of change with different stimulus. And as I said before, there's a lot of interest in understanding the biochemistry and the molecular adaptations to exercise. But if you're trying to measure performance, you need to set up your protocols so those mechanisms can be looked at just to examine and illuminate what you see, but not to interfere with the performance measure itself. So the kind of study that has biopsies or has people stopping to have blood samples taken at different points may not be able to give you the very precise measurement of performance that would otherwise occur when the athlete's not distracted. And then the final thing is that we need to consider that there's differences in individual athletes and their responsiveness to the outcome or to the intervention. And so we need to build into our design the ability to look for those differences. And again, if you're wanting to catch up with some more information about methodologies, this is a review paper that I've written recently looking at how this applies to measuring the outcomes of supplement use. And it goes through all these different characteristics. All right, let's go on to our next P, and that's personalised. The contemporary sports nutrition plan needs to be all about you. So when we're working with athletes, we need to be able to really personalise or individualise the sports nutrition plan so that it features the characteristics that are important for the event. And that's right down to not just the event itself, but the specific environment in which it's going to be conducted. So under the rules or the temperature or the conditions that event is done. And at an elite level, you wouldn't believe the amount of effort that goes into taking an athlete who's already very good at their event and then working out how they can do it at midnight, if they're in the IAAF World Championships last year, or whether it might be in the conditions of Tokyo. It's almost a new ball game sometimes when you take those extreme changes in the characteristics. But then you also need to look at the characteristics of the athlete and whether it's predictable kinds of characteristics like their sex, their age, their calibre, or whether it's specific to the individual. These all need to be built into the plan. And so there's a couple of ways which I think that these characteristics need to be thought about at the moment. The first one is just the recognition that most of the work that we do in sports science and sports nutrition is done on male athletes. And even though that we know just in general life, women are underrepresented in many aspects of what's important in life, the fact that they're not represented in sports nutrition research is really problematic when you're trying to take the results of the available literature and apply it to females. And it's interesting if you have a look, and this is just one of an example of studies that have been done like this. This is a survey of all the journal articles that were reported in 3 journals over a 5-month period in 2015. All these articles had to do with sports science or exercise and applications of different strategies. And the area in which the imbalance between sexes is the worst is in performance. If you have a look at the pie charts there, you can see that in all the studies that were reported that had an element of using a strategy to change performance, only 3% of those studies or those subjects that were in studies were females to isolate the effect of that performance strategy on females alone. Some studies involved both male and female subjects without differentiating, but at least had females represented. But the majority of the performance research is done on males. So that's certainly something that we need to redress the balance. Because as we know, men and women are quite different. This is the characteristic that gets most commentary in our house. But in terms of science, there's lots of ways in which we can think of men and women being different. Differences in body size, differences in the lean mass contribution to their body size. Females have a very complicated hormonal environment. Not only is it different to males, but it changes over the course of the menstrual cycle and then can be absent or present or modified in the terms of whether the athlete's having a regular menstrual cycle or is either amenorrheic or menopausal or on the oral contraceptive pill. We know that there are other different nutritional requirements between males and females, and there are lots of other characteristics that we're only just learning about, things that we can't explain, but often just through doing the science find that there's a different response in males and females to a certain strategy. And so there's a call for young scientists out there to try and help redress that imbalance. We talked before about having an ability through our research to be able to identify the individual responsiveness to a strategy. But there's a bit of a caveat that I want to point out here that we're all very quick to fall into doing badly. And this is the way that we often tackle our scientific studies now, where we have small groups. We present our research in terms of what the mean was, and here's just a study I've made up here. This is with our strategy X, and we've had 10 different subjects do a protocol twice, once with intervention X and once with a placebo. And what we do now is we report the mean and the standard deviation of the change, but we also report what happens to each of the individual athletes or participants in the study. And this is a quite common way that you'll see results presented in journals these days. That's terrific, but what I don't like is when people then say, oh, well, these two were the non-responders because they went backwards when they did the study with the strategy X, whereas all the people that had a performance improvement on that day when they took the strategy X, they are responders. And the problem with this, or at least if we think about it differently, is when you simply see a data set like that and you're trying to explain it, there's a whole lot of different ways in which you could explain the differences in the performance on those 2 days. It could simply be day-to-day variability, that every day we may have a different way in which we can perform, and that we caught 2 people on a bad day and all the other 8 on a good day. It had nothing to do with strategy X. It could be simply measurement error, that there's often ways in which studies are suffering from inaccuracies or imprecision in the measuring of the outcomes, and that could be a reason why some people seem to go in a different way than the others. It could be individual responsiveness, or the other alternative is who knows, and the correct answer is who knows. Simply looking at 2 data points in a group of athletes is not going to give you much credibility or confidence that you can really measure responsiveness. And so what we need to build into our studies, if we really do want to try and look for responsiveness, are other kinds of characteristics. Sometimes what you can do is have a very large sample size, and then you can know something about the characteristics of your sample, and able to build in covariate analysis to work out, yes, there are differences in responsiveness, and you can explain it by some sort of a characteristic. Other things that people are doing, which are quite nice, some of my colleagues, and we've done the same thing ourselves, is when we build the study design, we repeat one of the trials. So instead of just having 2 trials, we might have 3, or if we've got 2 different interventions, we might end up having 4 trials, and we repeat one of the trials. And so then you can see how robust or reproducible the outcomes are to distinguish between day-to-day variability and the effect of your strategy. Sometimes if you can measure mechanisms, that will explain whether there's a correlation between a mechanism and the performance that makes you more confident about it. Or a new thing that people are looking at is to see whether there's anything about the genetic makeup of the participants that might explain different outcomes. So it's worth having a little bit of a talk about that. So this is one of the new areas of medicine and nutrition that we recognise that our interaction with the world can have genetic influences, and that we're at the stage of being able to measure genes, and particularly to look at some of the polymorphisms from single differences, what we call a SNP, a single nucleotide polymorphism. And we've been able to identify some of these SNPs that seem to explain a difference in outcome to many aspects of health and performance. And often what's happening with these outcomes is that they're being commercialised. There are a lot of companies now that are undertaking this genetic discovery and being able to provide for consumers an option to go in and have your genetics examined and to identify whether you have a certain polymorphism of some of the genes that have been discovered to encode for a different output. This is certainly a very new area and a very exciting area, but we have to be a bit careful about how we use the knowledge so far, because in real life, most of the interactions between us and our genes and our stimuli are very complex, and there's probably a large number of different genes that all explain a certain outcome. Just as an example of how this is being developed, that's exciting, and this is looking at the caffeine research. We know now of at least 2 genes that can change our responsiveness to caffeine. The CYP1A2 gene is at the liver level, and it's working on the metabolism and how quickly we clear caffeine from our system. And then we've got the ADORA2A gene, which is encoding for adenosine receptors, and how the effect of caffeine is responsive in different organs in our body. And so people are being able to suggest that different alleles or different SNPs of these genes might encode for different outputs or different responsiveness to caffeine. And on the left-hand side, we've got some sort of suggestions from a nice review that was done by Craig Pickering, looking at these genes and what that might mean in terms of the way that people respond to caffeine and what you could do about it to get the best response from caffeine as an athlete. The problem is that the literature isn't consistent, that people who have one of the genes or one of the SNPs of a gene don't always respond in the way that you'd explain based on what we think we know about these polymorphisms. So it seems that even as simple as our responsiveness to caffeine is far more complex than what we can explain at the moment. And there may be some benefits in listening to this advice, but it's probably too early to say that you'd make all your decisions based on getting genetic testing. All right, just the last 2 to come home with. We want our performance nutrition to be practical, that we must always choose food and drink choices or give athletes advice about food and drink choices that suit the situation, and that sometimes we may see what might be optimal, but it's not possible to be achieved by the athlete. And so being pragmatic is the best outcome. And I always think back as a young dietitian of being so excited when I found some new information, and I probably wanted to overcomplicate the life of an athlete by insisting that they always had to take every strategy and apply it in the best hypothetical way possible. And that even though as a dietitian, our role is to be practical and to find ways in which we can make nutritional goals turn into the food choices or fluid choices that an athlete can have at different times, we've got to be making sure that we don't make it too complicated for the athlete. We need to be creative, but we also need to be pragmatic. And that we've also got to remember that food provides a large amount of the culture and the social interaction and enjoyment of life, and that we've still got to encode that into the plans that we give athletes. So sometimes I need to get down from being so excited about things, simplify it, make it more enjoyable, and recognise that sometimes the plan B is a really good option for the athlete, that it manages to achieve all the goals that are important to them rather than just hitting the hypothetical optimal. And then the last P is that your plan has to be practiced. You need to be able to keep practicing it so that you can improve it and tweak it, but also you need to keep practicing it so that you can adapt yourself to get better at the plan. And the examples here is that one of the things I think is an important role of the sports dietitian when working with athletes is to keep working with them and to review what they've done, to be able to do feedback after every time they've implemented a plan, completed, so that you sit down and you get the feedback at the time when people can remember it, learn from the experience and be prepared to keep changing it or tweaking it for the next time round. And a good example of that is the experience that we've seen with Eliud Kipchoge, who has managed to break 2 hours for the marathon, albeit in a contrived situation. The first time he tried, he had a whole range of things in his plan. He came very close, but failed to break the 2 hour mark by just a number of seconds. So when they went back to do it for the second time, they very much went through the first plan to redesign it based on the feedback that they got from the first. And that was part of that learning process that helped with the second attempt. But as I said, the last thing is to remember that not only are you tweaking the plan, but you're tweaking yourself by practicing it. And an example of that is we realise now that our gut is an organ like every other in the body, that you can habituate it to being better at what it does by practicing it. And we've certainly got an interest at the moment in helping athletes to both become more comfortable with being able to eat and drink during exercise, as well as to absorb the nutrients while they're exercising by practicing the art of consuming it during earlier training sessions to adapt the gut. And we've now got evidence that there's upregulation of many of the transporter molecules in the large small intestine that allow us to carry the important nutrients across the intestinal wall. And this is particularly the case with the carbohydrate story. And just an example of how that can be put into practice is a really nice study that was done by Ricardo Costa, an Australian colleague of mine. He had some athletes do a 2-week training program where they did their exercise every day, either training with just a placebo intake or having 90 grams an hour of a carbohydrate source. Once it was a glucose fructose supplement, a manufactured sports food, and one was just having a carbohydrate food. And before and after the 2 weeks of training, he got them to do an exercise test involving a performance trial, and they had to have 90 grams per hour of the glucose fructose supplement. And what he found is, compared to the pre-test, after the 2 weeks of training, those athletes that had trained with the carbohydrate sources became more tolerant of consuming it. There was a reduction in their symptoms of distress, gut discomfort and distress when they took those very large amounts of carbohydrate during running, and there was a reduction in their breath hydrogen measurements suggesting there's less malabsorption. But even between the carbohydrate supplement and the carbohydrate food, there were small differences that when you practice with the exact food, you got better at having that exact food in terms of tolerating it and absorbing it. And you can see there's an improvement in performance after the 2 weeks of the gut training with nothing else than training with that particular food that was to be used in the event. So there's our 6 Ps. The planned, the periodised, the proven, the personalised, the practical and the practiced. And our goal as a sports dietitian is to put those all into the blender and hope they can rearrange themselves into some more P's: peak performance, podium placings, and personal pride. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Louise. That was fantastic and a lot of new topics you addressed there. We've got a few questions, Louise. A lot of them are around carbohydrate availability. Can you talk to us about that and how intermittent fasting is relate to carbohydrate availability, and how practically you would advise an athlete, specifically if they are looking to become leaner and perhaps even make a certain weight category for sports? Oh, sorry, and quickly, what you can tell us about is how you would advise them in terms of that fasting period or that low carbohydrate availability, how you would advise them to address that in terms of their training timing.
Okay, so there's two separate thoughts in there that are sort of overlapping. So one, we're talking about the energy and availability of energy to both sustain training, but also to manipulate body composition. And then we've got the separate one about carbohydrate availability in terms of both fueling the session or depriving the session of the glycogen to get the better training adaptation. So what often happens in life is that we get a new idea, and as I showed you with the train low, that when people get the first look at the idea, they kind of go crazy with it, and so they think of it as being the only true way of doing things, and it's, you know, it's got to be done all the time, and it's only beneficial, instead of recognizing that most of the areas in which we have goals may have different ways of approaching it, but also what might be good for one thing is not necessarily good for another thing. So why don't we think about the energy availability first, and thinking about manipulating body composition or trying to enhance metabolism through the energy restriction. And that's a really controversial area. I think that the area of the intermittent fasting, and again, we'll have to look what our definitions are, because intermittent fasting is, well, the background to it is that it's really meaning that we've got different ways over the week in which we eat our calories, and the first diets that promoted the intermittent fasting were things like the 5-2 diet, which say that on 2 days of the week you have very restricted intake, and then on the 5 other days of the week you can eat what you like. And the idea of doing that was to create some energy restriction that helped with weight loss, and the weight loss then helped with metabolic improvements. So this is an idea that's been based on weight changes in sedentary people or mildly active people. Whether it has a transfer to sport has really not been clearly thought through. And I think it's quite difficult for an athlete to do that because the energy availability of their training program may be at odds with the way that the restricted days of eating fall. And so athletes that I know that have tried to practice this have had difficulties because it's very difficult for them to eat very small amounts on days that are high training days and still train well, and then be able to get the benefits of the weight manipulation and be able to then not over-consume or binge eat on the 5 days when they're allowed to eat as much as they like. So I'm not really convinced that intermittent fasting, where we have the restriction on a day approach, like days of the week approach, is useful. I'm not sure even in the sedentary populations whether it has anything marvellous to do other than to find a way for people to eat fewer calories. And sometimes when there's a new idea or a new strategy, people can follow it really well because it's exciting and new, but then gradually they get ways of being able to cheat, if you like. So I have had some colleagues or some friends that have tried the fast 2 diet, 5-2 diet, the intermittent fasting, and found that it works at first, but it doesn't work in the long term because people just learn to eat more on the 5 days that they can eat more, and it becomes a sort of a binge and a restricted feeding, which often then, you know, becomes almost disordered eating because people get so caught up in it. The other way in which this fasting idea has been looked at more recently is what I call time-restricted feeding, and that's the idea of reducing the number of hours in the day that you eat. We're just about to start looking at a study on this, actually, if we can get through the COVID problems. But one of the ways in which it's been proposed to be beneficial is by, again, helping people with their weight loss, but also improving metabolic profiles. And that may have some application certainly in overweight people and sedentary people. And there's some, you know, evidence that it may have some effects independently of the restriction of calories, because it's much easier to eat fewer calories if you've got fewer hours in the day to eat them. But again, when you're trying to apply that to athletes, we have to think about energy availability and the benefits that you might have in spreading food over a longer portion of the day. And you know, it's interesting that we might be thinking about energy restriction being beneficial for athletes on one hand, and yet there's a whole lot of literature showing that eating protein in a wide spread over the day is really important for protein synthesis. And so sometimes trying to find the marrying of those two different ideas is tricky. And it might mean that there's, like periodised nutrition before, as I said, there's times when you might do something or days that you might do something, and it might be different on other days because the goals are different. So I guess the bottom line is that I don't think there's a single approach that's useful for athletes, that some of these ideas that have been seen in sedentary populations to be useful don't transfer well to all the goals of sports nutrition. And some of the benefits that have been seen with the time-restricted feeding or the intermittent fasting can simply be explained by the weight loss that accompanies just using or eating less food. And it'll be interesting to see when we do our study when we're trying to have athletes contain their food to a smaller number of hours in the day, whether it's actually possible for them to eat enough in that period of time comfortably so that it doesn't interfere with their training. Because a lot of athletes who are doing 2 or 3 training sessions a day, regardless of how many calories that they want to eat, they have to space it very cleverly so that they don't have, you know, gastrointestinal upsets during the exercise itself. So I think there's a big danger in taking an idea that's worked on one population and thinking that it always will transfer as a benefit to sports populations, or that that you can forget all the other aspects of sports nutrition that might be important. So it's one of the challenges I think we have as sports dietitians as to what parts you take from different theories or different pieces of evidence around some nutrition goals, and how you can then integrate them into the goals of the athlete or the specific athlete and the specific time of training that they're doing. I'm sorry if that's a very long answer. I hope I got some of it there.
Yeah, I think you answered a few questions within that. But I mean, from what I get out of that is that personalized nutrition, it totally depends on the amount of training, the hours of training in a day. And time-restricted fasting is probably much easier for athletes today, and perhaps even sub-elite athletes where their energy demands are not as high.
That's right. Also, the numbers of hours of training that they're doing in a day. You know, often when I'm working with athletes who might be doing 2 or 3 training sessions a day, there's 6, 7, 8 hours of training, and if they're only able to eat over 8 hours or whatever the time restricted feeding suggests is optimum, it just totally interferes with the way their training needs to go. And sometimes if you've got flexibility, you might be able to work with the athletes so that they can spread their training out so that the 8 hours of eating and the 8 hours of training still have room to work in their waking hours. But, you know, when you've got athletes who might be in a pool, or they've got, you know, they can't change their training times because they're working in a squad, or they're working with the availability of facilities, it's very difficult for them to have enough flexibility with changing their training.
Yeah. Okay, so since we're talking about diets, and whenever I do talks, this is always one of the first questions that comes up, is what is your take on ketogenic diets for the athletes? I mean, there is certainly evidence that's coming out in favor of it, but we'd like to hear your views on it.
Well, look, it depends who you are and what your goals are. So the ketogenic diet there's no doubt that it enhances your ability to burn fat as an exercise fuel. And so if you're an athlete whose event requires moderate intensity exercise for a long period of time, doesn't require ability to have a very high intensity gear to be able to surge or sprint to the end, and you're in an event where it's difficult to feed during the event for one reason or another, then becoming very good at burning fat at low intensities is a perfectly reasonable strategy. And so when you look at some of the athletes who've been successful in using it, you know, they tend to be people who do 100-mile events running. But even then, you'll find when you talk to them that they often have a ketogenic diet background, but then on the race day, they may have some carbohydrate as well. So again, they're periodising the way they do things. We've spent quite a bit of time tackling whether the ketogenic diet is good for athletes in endurance races that have a higher intensity demand to their sport, whether it's either because the whole event is done at high intensity. You know, people think about endurance sport being fat burning, but I'm telling you that when Eliud Kipchoge runs a marathon, he's not burning very much fat. In fact, if he burns any fat, you know, it's at the expense of speed, really, because when you talk about fat and carbohydrate as exercise fuel, even though fat has got more calories per gram, or can produce more produce more ATP per gram, it requires more oxygen to do it. And so that's one of the things that we found with our studies, our supernova studies, that when you adapt to being a fat burning athlete, it means you have to have more oxygen to be able to burn that fat. So if you normally are doing your exercise at 70% of VO2 max, when you're burning fat, it'll probably take you to say 74%, 75% of VO2 max to run at the same speed or produce the same ATP output. Now, that's not a problem if you're doing moderate intensity exercise. But if you're Eliud Kipchoge and you're running at 85% of VO2 max, right on the sort of the so-called lactate threshold, if you're burning more fat, you're going to have to burn, or you're going to have to deliver more oxygen to the muscle to work at the same speed. And sometimes that's the problem. You know, athletes are already working at the highest amount of oxygen capacity that they can consistently deliver. So in our hands, when we've had athletes adapted to high-fat diets, they simply can't run or walk at those very high speeds anymore. And so if their event requires that, whether it's to be able to do it for the whole event like Eliud Kipchoge, or whether it's like Chris Froome or any of the other Tour de France cyclists, most, you know, over 3 weeks, the average output or the average speed or the average intensity of what they're working might be 60 to 65% VO2 max. It's not very high, but the guy that wins is the guy that can sprint to the line or go up the hills at a much higher intensity and can sustain that. And that's where carbohydrate as a fuel has benefits over fat. So it's a matter of understanding what your event is and what it takes to be successful. And if being able to produce sustained, very high intensity outputs is important, well, then the ketogenic diet is going to interfere with that. And we've tried all sorts of combinations of having people adapted to ketogenic diets and either putting them back on carbs for a little while or just having carbs on the day of the event. And we've found that it's very hard to integrate, that once you've adapted to the high-fat diet, it impairs your ability to burn glycogen, even if you have it available. So trying to integrate the two together isn't really successful. We've found that really the better approach is to be carbohydrate supported, and by doing the periodised carbohydrate training to be able to maximise mitochondrial biogenesis so that you've got plenty of mitochondria that you gain through your training. But on race day, you want to have those full of glycogen and being able to use that glycogen as efficiently as possible.
Thanks. And then, of course, it's also that carbohydrate availability in terms of immune support, or if you restrict carbohydrates too much, you obviously can suppress your immune function.
Yes, so we've found also
sorry.
that there's quite a few body systems that do better with high carbohydrate availability. In the studies that we've done, when we put people on ketogenic diets, we find that there's an increase in the IL-6 response to exercise. So there's an increase in these pro-inflammatory markers, and downstream of that, there's changes with iron metabolism, with bone metabolism. We've seen changes in the microbiome, and most of those have been in directions that aren't positive or aren't healthy. Now, that's completely different, though, to the person who's overweight and loses weight by being on a ketogenic diet. They often show benefits to metabolism and inflammatory responses, etc. But that's the result of the weight loss more so than the ketogenic diet. So you've always got to think about things in context as to what the outcome's going to be. And if you're taking somebody who's got very poor nutrition and is overweight, then they'll obviously have a different response than somebody who's already metabolically flexible and is not looking to lose weight.
Okay. Okay, and then a quick one, which is the train low model. Does that mean that athletes who use pre-workouts before every session would have, well, they say a reduced performance benefit, or I guess reduced patience to that training session?
So that was using train low, or using low carbohydrate availability to maximise a training adaptation for some sessions, and then realising that you've lost quality of the session. Is that what we're talking about?
I think, well, how I interpret it is, would people that use a workout, would they not then gain
Yes.
as much of an adaptation compared to people who low or on low glycogen availability?
Well, I think if you're doing the session with low carbohydrate availability, you'll get some benefit from doing that. If you can enhance the quality of the session at the same time, I know a lot of people that might have some caffeine during that session, or they might do carbohydrate mouth rinse during that session, just so they feel a bit better and can push their way through it. But the bigger picture would be not just doing that for the session, but making sure that you put the train low into the whole program the right number of times. Like, you're not trying to do it too many times close to competition so that you're becoming fatigued before you race. It's probably best done in the earlier part of the base phase of the training, and that you don't, you get the balance right between the quality sessions that you're doing and those more fatiguing sessions that might be driving adaptation. And so it's a balance that changes over time towards getting to the race line.
Okay, thank you. And then just a question from Nikki. She was saying, how much emphasis do you place on measuring the numbers in terms of an athlete's intensity? And she's referring to like a VO2 max in terms of recommending the quantity of carbohydrate.
So the quantity of carbohydrate in terms of
measurements of, she said intensity, which I assume is their VO2 max or their individual.
Okay, so I think what I'm interpreting here is that how would I look at the intensity of the session in terms of percentage of VO2 max and deciding how much carbohydrate to support it?
Yes.
Well,
yeah,
it's not just the intensity of the session, it's what the athlete wants to get out of the session as well. So, some sessions athletes do to practice for competition, whether it's to practice strategies they're going to use in competitions, or that it's practicing the sort of the quality outputs. They want to be able to hit these numbers. They want to be able to practice some skills. They want to have all elements of their competition being able to be practiced in that training session. So those kinds of sessions I would support as well as I could with carbohydrate. And you don't have to do them all the time. It might be that, you're doing them once a week in base phase or once every 2 weeks in base phase. But when you get closer to competition, you might want to practice those more often. And in those, I'd be saying, yes, do all the carbohydrate strategies that you're going to use in a race. And that might be dictated by what the race is going to allow you to do. So it mightn't be optimal on paper, but it might be what's going to happen in the race. And so you're going to start practicing that. And that would be around, having carbohydrate the night before. So you've got plenty of glycogen storage. You have pre-event carbohydrate. You have carbohydrate during, as would be able to be into your event. Whereas other sessions, you might say, well, look, this session's more about just recovery, or this session's more about, gaining some, you wanting to do some train low to maximise some of the adaptations. And in those, you think about restricting carbohydrate and whether it's a sequence of having the one session to strip the glycogen and then do the next session with low glycogen. And you find out what's tolerated by the athlete. Some athletes can do that really well and they get better at over time. Other athletes so sensitive that they need to have a little bit of carbohydrate just to be able to complete the session or, to function. So it's about looking at the overall program, put the big goals together, but then take each session to see how it's contributing to those goals and how you might manipulate the carbohydrate around it so that you get what you need from that session. And even then experiment with the athlete and see how it all works together. Sometimes you have to sort of think about it from a macro level, that you might find that an athlete who does too many train low sessions gets through those sessions okay, but then they start getting ragged and not being able to train well for the following sessions. And so you sort of have to pull back, not because they couldn't do the sessions, but because they pay a penalty for it down the track. And that's part of the beauty of working with the athlete, to be able to listen to feedback and refine and keep working on it to get better at achieving the goals.
And then just lastly, Louise, if to avoid overwhelming an athlete that you're working with, what would be the 2 or 3 perhaps main things that you would focus on to avoid overwhelming them with information?
Oh, that's a good one. I often put it back to the athlete about where they think their weaknesses are, or where they think they might get some quick gains. And if you can get them to prioritise for you, for a lot of athletes, it's about changing body composition. It might be, manipulating physique. For some athletes, they might just say, I just don't feel snappy in these training sessions, or I'm not getting the numbers that my coach wants me to do when I'm doing these kind of quality sessions. And I think it's because I'm not fueled well enough. So if the athlete can give you their perspective on what the priority areas are, then you can usually work backwards and, find some way in which you can get some quick wins. But, often what I will do with an athlete is listen to the whole history, listen to what they say and say, look, there's a whole range of things we can do. I've thought of some more that you haven't even identified. But if we put them all down on paper, let's work together to say, where do you think the wins are going to be? And sometimes it might be that you get some wins on the top by doing some little, small things, but at the same time, you need to negotiate with them that we might need to go back and fix up some foundational things. Sometimes athletes just want to tinker with something when you think really, they haven't got the whole, they're not planned, they're not organised, they haven't got just, a nutrient dense, well chosen diet, or haven't got the food skills, they haven't got the cooking skills. And so even though they might they are interested in whether they should be taking creatine, sometimes you have to explain to them that we can do that, but there's going to be more long-term advantage if we can get some of the more fundamental things right. So listen to the athlete, but also, be prepared to offer them some other alternatives that might be not what they've identified themselves as being necessary.
Thank you, Louise. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Pippa, for managing those questions, and Louise for an absolutely superb talk and journey through bespoke sports nutrition. And I think that's the take-home message. It's really got to be personalized. And actually, it's a message that's come through a lot of our webinars on different topics. And I hope that people realize, whether we're clinicians or scientists, that issues are often that much more complex than certainly athletes perhaps appreciate, or that you can elucidate on a 240 character tweet. And we need to really take responsibility for that as the clinicians and scientists who are conveying that information. And that came across very strongly for me. So thank you for preparing this presentation, for giving us an up-to-date idea of where we should be heading with sports nutrition, and for giving up your time on an evening in Canberra. We really do appreciate it.
A pleasure, and have a happy holiday for the rest of you. And can't wait till I can get back to South Africa sometime.
Absolutely. We owe you a safari, so we look forward to it. Thanks very much. Have a good evening.
Bye then.
Great.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Louise.
Thank you, Louise.
Thanks, John.
Great. Thank you, Pippa. And for the rest of you, I'm going to share a slide on the screen which will tell you a little bit about our next talk, which is a very, very exciting one on exertional injury, with an emphasis on rhabdomyolysis from an expert in the United States with a lot of expertise and experience in managing this condition in athletes and in the military. So make sure that you're tuned in on Tuesday, the 29th of September at 7 p.m., where Dr. Fran Connor will be talking to us from the United States. Click on the link, the red cap link, for your CPD points. Thank you to Asino and Nita Pharmaceuticals for their sponsorship, and for all of you for attending. And have a great Heritage Day. Go and light up those braais. Despite this being a nutrition talk, you're allowed to take a beer out of the fridge. So have a great rest of the Heritage Day, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you.